Right, this morning we are looking at Baptist history and talk a little bit about kind of an exciting period, a new period in American history in the 1800s. But if you remember, we're going to look at this morning missionary efforts to the American Indians, to the indigenous people that were here as we discovered America. You might remember as we talked about Roger Williams back last year. We talked about Roger Williams, and he was a man that was a Baptist. He was a Puritan preacher from England. He came over to Massachusetts Bay Colony and quickly fell out of favor there. He found that there was a state church in Massachusetts Bay, much like the one he had left in England. That's why he had left England. And so he continued to preach God's word and fell out of favor, and they threw him out of Massachusetts Bay, and he had nowhere to go. There was no other place to go, and so he went to the Indians in that area, and he befriended those Indians. He genuinely loved those Indians. He moved among them, witnessed to them, led many to the Lord. Built a great relationship with them. If you remember that relationship, then when Dr. John Clark came to America, the Indians sold Dr. John Clark and Williams a tract of land that we know as today as Rhode Island. And so they were able to begin their churches there. Dr. Clark began what was the first Baptist church in America there in Rhode Island. And so that's the first efforts, kind of not official, but those were true efforts into the American Indians. And it wasn't until, almost 100 years later, that there were formal efforts by Baptists to reach to the Indians, reach out to the Indians. And in about 1823, several churches got together, ordained some missionaries, and sent them into the really what was the frontier, the wilderness, to minister to missionaries in different regions. And this morning we want to look at one area, really the first area that Americans went to, and that was the Creek tribe that was located in Georgia. Now, in that time, the Indians were being moved out of Georgia. They would go into Alabama, then they eventually pushed them further west, the American government would. But, and that story is happening kind of in the middle of all this, but that we've talked about that, and that kind of very sad time in American history where that happened. But there were missionaries, Daniel Marshall and his son, moving among those people even during that move, and from Georgia, and leading just thousands of Indians to the Lord over those times. But we want to look at a man today. Our focus will be on a man who is part of the Creek evangelism, and or the evangelism of the Creek people. And Joseph Islands was born into the Creek tribe in the colony of Georgia. He very quickly, as a very young boy, was moved. His tribe was moved into Alabama. And I don't know much about the early days of Joseph Islands. That's his name. He seemed to be almost maybe homeless or an orphan, raised almost on the street in a sense because of some of the things that happened. But he grew up in a very rough situation, and basically it's no man's land out there. It's the frontier. And at one point, there is a part of his story that he was going to get into a fight with a bunch of other boys, and he drew a knife, and this wouldn't have gone well. The boys were white boys, and the Indians, that wouldn't have gone well for him, no matter how that ended up. And so a Baptist pastor actually was there, just happened to be there, and saw this happening, and he literally just grabbed Joseph Islands and hauled him away before he could hurt himself or hurt them, because he knew what direction that might go. And he took him in, and this is why I say there must have been some sort of homelessness. He didn't have a family, it seems. He took him in, and he fed him, and he lived there with his family there for a while. And he witnessed to him, taught him Scripture, gave him a Bible, and really tried to lead him to the Lord in those weeks that he was with that Baptist family. Islands rejected that, and he left and went and really moved west, and then again grew into adulthood on the frontier. Somewhere along the line, somebody gave him a violin, and he actually became a very accomplished violinist. And I guess it might be he was a fiddler. And the reason that is even important is because he became very popular then in a very worldly crowd. The Indian tribes would have dances and just these huge gatherings, and he became very famous for his violin talent. And he would play at these dances, and many of the dances at the end of the dance would turn into basically just a drunken brawl, and people were always hurt, always sometimes killed. And actually, in 1842, in one night, he was in his mid-20s, I believe. During a drunken brawl, his best friend was killed, and this just devastated the young man. He just really had a grave effect on him. And the next day, he went to the area where they were going to bury his friend, and an old slave had been assigned to dig the grave. His name was Billy. And old Billy, as he was known, was really a godly Christian man. And Billy dug the grave, they buried his friend, and Billy saw the great distress on the heart of the young man, and he used that subject of death, and that, as the young man talked about the great beyond, and he used that to share the gospel, and he taught him about Christ coming and dying and rising again. And that brought back memories of his conversations several years earlier with that Baptist family that he had gone in with for a few weeks. Billy was able to lead him to the Lord in the days following that burial. And Joseph Islands, after he was saved, just became on fire for the Lord, and began to witness to his friends, of course, and his near friends. But there was a problem in that day. There were very strict laws in the Creek tribes about introducing Christianity or getting together or publicly talking to people about Christianity. And anyone found engaged in Christian activity, Christian worship, was severely beaten. They were given 39 lashes by the police. And this law continued for many years. But Billy and Joseph Islands would meet secretly, and they would talk about biblical things. Now Joseph Islands could read, and he would read these passages. Billy was illiterate; he couldn't read, but he'd been in church all his life, and he explained the passages to Joseph, and Joseph grew, and they met. Eventually, people are gathering with them. They couldn't remain silent. People are being saved, and eventually the group numbered about 30 people. And of course, that was brought to the attention of the authorities when the group got so big. So the police were urged to have greater vigilance and find this group and stop this gathering. So they sent out spies. They were very secretive. They would meet in different places each night. One occasion, I read a story in reading about this that the police would send out spies, they said, and they would try to find this gathering. They would go through the woods systematically trying to find where these people were meeting on a certain night. And one night, the spy was laying on the ground in the woods, and he was right near, just a few feet away from the gathering, and Islands was praying. Islands didn't know that the spy was right there, but he was praying for his people. He was praying for the police. He was praying for those persecutors, and he was praying for the spies because they knew that there were spies out there hunting them down. In fact, Islands, as he prayed, knew who the spies were, and he prayed specifically for the man that was laying just a few feet away by name. And of course, God used that to really convict the heart of that spy that was laying there. The next night, the spy found them where they were meeting, and he stood up in the middle of them. He told them how he had come under great conviction. Someone pulled him aside and led him to the Lord that night. Just wonderful stories like that you read about this man and what he did. Well, they were not always as successful in hiding. One time they were surrounded and captured, all of them. One by one, they were led away to receive their beatings. Even the women received 39 lashes from the police. The small church. But the one historian says the serenity and submission overcame their persecutors, and the captain even tried to shame them. But even, as I said, the women unflinchingly endured the beatings. And the next day, the captain and several of his men resigned their positions, and they said they could not whip these people who were praying to and loving Jesus. And so this is the testimony and the hardships that these people went through. Well, Joseph would not be quiet, and so he continually was talking and witnessing, leading people to the Lord. And because, again, go back to that violin playing, he was so well known in the Creek tribe, which numbered tens of thousands of people, that he was able to reach the highest levels of the Creek tribe, and he actually led to the Lord the wealthiest chief. The family name is McIntosh. The chief has a funny name. His name was Chili McIntosh, and he was the most powerful chief in the Creek nation, and actually was the leader of the Creek nation. And Joseph Islands was able to lead him to the Lord, and that began a series of really people being led to the Lord. Years later, we find that 3 of McIntosh's children became Baptist pastors. And, of course, that changed everything for the Creek tribe. And McIntosh, now that he's saved, he went before the Creek Council, and he convinced them to stop this persecution of Christians, and they did. That ended. So now Joseph Islands was completely free to continue witnessing. And what he did then is he began these groups that had met. There were 6 or 7 of them at that point. He organized them into churches. Each one of them called a pastor, and we have these 6 or 7 Baptist churches beginning then as soon as that they are legal to go forward. And so just a very interesting moment. And Islands was ordained during that time, became pastor of one of those churches. And what's interesting about all this is that from the time that he was saved, I believe in 1842, the law came to an end in 1845, and Joseph Islands would die in 1848. So it was only a 6-year period of time where he was a Christian and was able to do all this. Just kind of fascinating. And as far as I can tell, there's no historical record, it seems, of how he died or why he died so young, because he seemed to be in his early 30s, 31 or 32 when he died. And you think about that. The Lord knew, and in God's providence, his ministry was done, and he had 6 years. And he was able to lead so many people to the Lord and establish so many churches that he's known in Baptist history as the apostle to the Creeks. And his name is very famous in historical references throughout, and the efforts that would continue after his death, and Baptist churches starting, and just hundreds and hundreds of people being saved. And so we look at that and we say, well, that's unfortunate. From a human standpoint, it seems like it's unfortunate. He's only able to live 6 years as a Christian. But of course, God knows that. And as I said, Lord knew that he had finished his course, and took him home the end of February 1848. And we want to thank the Lord this morning for this kind of unusual story, but these backstories of American history, and how this is a Baptist story also. And I want to thank the Lord for Joseph Islands and for his efforts, his strength as a Christian to fight through this persecution, and the Lord truly blessed, and thousands of people would be saved in the Creek Nation because of his efforts. And I want to thank the Lord for that this morning.